The money doesn't explode. It hesitates. 1 second longer at the register. A pause before the tap. A look between strangers that wasn't there last week. Cards still swipe. Screens still glow, but nobody releases anything solid. That's the moment you're supposed to feel it. You're already behind the curve, and the curve doesn't care if you noticed. You think this is about gold. Everyone does. Heavy. Shiny. Ancient. That belief gets people hurt. Gold reflects light, and light reflects attention. Attention is the first thing that gets taxed when systems fail. The people who last don't carry symbols. They carry interruptions, small, dull objects that stop problems before they escalate. This is where most people get it wrong. They picture value rising smoothly, like a chart in a finance app. Collapse doesn't work that way. Value spikes under pressure, unevenly, violently. The moment currency loses trust, objects inherit responsibility. Not because they're precious, but because they remove friction. Hunger delayed, cold softened, pain reduced, noise silenced. Look around your city. It's full of objects that have never been tested. Kitchens designed for photos. Flashlights with dead batteries. Tools bought to signal competence, not produce it. And hidden among them are things that cost almost nothing now and later decide who gets to refuse a deal. Not power, leverage. The quiet ability to say no without explaining yourself. The mistake doesn't kill you immediately. It waits. It waits until you trade away something irreplaceable for short-term relief. Until favors replace planning. Until smiles turn into accounting. That's when you learn the real problem isn't scarcity, it's replacement. Anything that breaks and can't be swapped becomes wealth overnight. Remember this. Wealth isn't what people desire. It's what interrupts panic. The person who can stop bleeding without drama. The one who can make a room usable again. The one who can turn foul water neutral. They don't look rich. They look forgettable. That's not an accident. Invisibility is protective coloration. And it gets worse. Because the next phase isn't barter, it's sorting. Once people understand what actually matters, they start tracking who has it. Quiet items outperform loud ones here. Things you can hide. Things that don't spoil quickly. Things that don't announce themselves until someone else admits need first. This is the part people forget. The most dangerous moment isn't the shortage. It's the realization. When everyone understands at the same time that preparation was optional yesterday and mandatory today. That's when shelves don't empty. They disappear. That's when prices stop updating because availability itself collapses. By the time you decide to prepare, you won't be late by minutes. You'll be late by phases. The market will already have memory. It will remember who planned, who panicked, and who paid too much for too little. The city keeps score even when the screens go dark. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where the survivors are watching from. And hit subscribe while you're here. You don't notice the moment value flips because nothing dramatic happens. No alarms, no headlines. Just a fraction of a second where conversation stalls and someone hesitates before paying. That pause is the sound of trust draining out of the system. Money doesn't fail loudly. It loses momentum. And once momentum is gone, people stop believing tomorrow will behave. The problem isn't inflation. Inflation is just a symptom people understand because it has numbers. The real fracture is continuity. Systems only work when tomorrow looks enough like today that planning feels reasonable. The moment tomorrow becomes a question mark, anything that extends yesterday gains weight. Objects that preserve routine, even partially, begin to matter more than symbols of wealth. This is the part everyone misses. They rush toward food. Food feels urgent, visible, emotional. It also vanishes fast. It spoils. It smells. It draws attention. And worst of all, it creates dependency. Feeding people locks you into repetition. The ones who profit when currency dies aren't providing calories. They're preserving function. They're keeping small, fragile systems running just long enough to stay relevant. Heat exposes this better than anything else. Not warmth. Control. The ability to add or subtract heat without smoke, noise, or negotiation. When heat becomes irregular, people don't argue over blankets for long. They argue over whatever makes a space usable again. The object that stabilizes temperature quietly becomes more valuable than the fuel that creates it. The mistake doesn't punish immediately. It waits weeks until batteries are drained. Until fuel becomes identifiable by smell. Until improvisation turns into visible failure. That's when the items nobody respected become central. Not because they're rare, but because no one thought to replace them. Neglect matures into leverage. This is where it turns lethal. Trade stops being casual. It becomes remembered. Every exchange is logged. Who helped? Who charged? Who revealed too much? Generosity without control gets punished later. Hoarding gets noticed. Precision survives. Offering just enough relief without altering how you're perceived keeps you off lists that don't need to be written down. Here's the reframe most people never make. Value isn't in what an item does, it's in what it prevents. Noise draws attention. Infection spreads obligation. Delay creates desperation. Dependency creates enemies. Anything that quietly removes a second problem becomes worth more than something that loudly solves the first. People who last long enough to trade well don't advertise. They wait. They let silence do the work. The object doesn't appear until the other person names the problem out loud. That moment transfers control. Price stops being a discussion. Access becomes the currency. Remember this: usefulness compounds over time. The longer something continues to work, the more invisible it becomes. And invisibility is protection. Visibility kills, not immediately, but eventually. And in a world that's already forgetting how to plan, eventual is close enough to matter. By now, the market has memory. Not records, memory. Every exchange leaves residue. Tone shifts, names stick. People remember how you made them feel when they needed something. This is where amateurs disappear. Not violently, quietly. They make one bad trade, one revealing move, and the system corrects them out of relevance. They still think wealth means accumulation. Piles, stock, volume. That instinct is expensive. Real wealth at this stage is optionality, the ability to walk away from a bad deal without triggering suspicion or consequence. Optionality only comes from items that solve problems repeatedly without being consumed. If it vanishes when used, it isn't wealth, it's bait. This is where most people get caught. They trade away something irreplaceable because it feels insignificant. Small, lightweight, cheap, the kind of thing you assume you can always buy again. That assumption is poison. Later never arrives intact. Supply chains don't reboot cleanly. They restart twisted. Missing components, wrong specifications, incompatible fixes that almost work and then fail under load. That's when certain objects stop being useful and start becoming anchors. Not glamorous ones. Not complete tools, components. Interfaces, adapters. The quiet pieces that allow other systems to keep functioning. When something breaks and you're the only one who can bridge the gap, negotiation flips direction. You don't ask for terms, they offer them. The delayed consequence isn't physical, it's social. People begin associating you with continuity, not comfort, not safety, function. You become the person things still work around. That doesn't make you trusted. It makes you tolerated, and tolerated is the highest status left. Trusted people get tested. Tolerated people get space. Remember this detail. Items that require explanation lose value. The moment you have to justify, demonstrate, or teach, you expose yourself. Items that produce a result without conversation grow in value precisely because they remove interaction. Less talk, fewer questions. Lower risk. And it gets worse again. Scarcity sharpens observation. People start noticing patterns. Who never seems surprised, who always has just enough, who doesn't scramble. This is where even smart people make fatal errors. They scale too quickly. They let success repeat too cleanly. Visibility creeps in sideways. Stories start forming. That's when your cheap object stops being cheap. It becomes a signal, a marker, something people associate with you instead of the problem it solves. That's dangerous. Signals invite attention, and attention attracts pressure. Pressure breaks things that don't bend. The correct response isn't withdrawal. It's fragmentation, rotation. Letting objects circulate without you attached to them. Trades routed through others. Timing staggered, availability made inconsistent. The wealth remains, but your silhouette dissolves. People remember the fix, not the source. Survival isn't about being prepared. It's about being forgettable while everyone else improvises. Tomorrow isn't a promise. It's a stress test, and the world keeps watching who fails it the same way twice. By the time people start calling it the new normal, everything that mattered has already hardened. That phrase isn't acceptance, it's sedation. It dulls attention while habits lock in place. Once routines form, they become difficult to interrupt, and anything that supports them gains weight far beyond its material value. This is where wealth stops behaving like trade and starts behaving like gravity. No negotiations. No persuasion, just quiet pull. People orient their decisions around whatever keeps their day from collapsing. When something becomes predictable, removing it feels like sabotage. Control no longer needs enforcement. It's built into expectation. The mistake doesn't punish immediately. It waits until people stop checking alternatives. Until dependence becomes invisible. That's when certain objects stop circulating and start anchoring behavior. They don't move from hand to hand anymore. They stay close to the point of failure. Whoever controls them doesn't threaten. Gravity handles compliance. Most people still think this is about possession. It isn't. Possession attracts attention. Timing avoids it. The rich survivor doesn't own more. They intervene less often, but at exactly the right moment. Scarcity is managed through rhythm, not volume. Cheap items that create wealth at this stage don't solve emergencies, they solve maintenance. The dull, repetitive breakdowns that wear people down slowly. The part that fails every week. The component that degrades quietly. The consumable nobody tracked because it was always there. Fatigue, not fear, is what drives demand now. This is the part everyone gets wrong. They stay focused on crisis events, shortages, conflict, visible collapse. But the real leverage emerges in the long decay, when nothing feels dramatic anymore. When people are exhausted from adapting, when inconvenience becomes intolerable, that's when relief becomes currency. Remember this. Anything that restores normalcy, even partially, becomes addictive. And addiction is more reliable than fear. People will trade more to avoid discomfort than to escape danger. Consistency feels like safety, even when it isn't. The reframe matters here. This isn't about controlling people. It's about controlling friction. Whoever reduces friction shapes behavior without being seen. Doors open without asking. Favors appear unprompted. Information moves sideways. Influence accumulates quietly. And it gets worse. Once people adapt to reduced friction, its absence feels punitive. They don't blame systems. They blame whoever last removed the discomfort. This is where restraint becomes survival. You don't flood the area with relief. You let absence do the teaching. Rich survivors understand pacing. They allow small failures to occur, just enough to be felt, not enough to escalate. Then they restore function without ceremony. No speeches, no gratitude. Just continuity returning as if nothing happened. That's how objects become authority without uniforms. At this stage, people stop asking what things are worth. They ask who has them. Value detaches from objects and latches onto names. That's when markets fold inward, becoming smaller, sharper, more personal. Exchange stops being about utility and starts being about access. And access always wants a face. This is where most people get caught. They mistake recognition for protection. They think being known makes them untouchable. It doesn't. Being known is a liability with a timer attached. Every time your name circulates, it accumulates assumptions, expectations, resentments. Eventually, someone decides to test whether the story about you is true. The items that generate real wealth now are deniable. Plausibly. Casually. Things you can claim ran out, broke, or were traded away weeks ago, even if they're still with you. Especially if they're still with you. Availability becomes a rumor you never confirm. Scarcity becomes believable because you never argue with it. The delayed consequence shows up socially. People remember refusals more clearly than generosity. Every no leaves a sharper imprint than 10 quiet favors. That's why rich survivors don't refuse directly. They deflect, delay, redirect. The object never appears, but the relationship survives intact. Memory stays neutral instead of hostile. Remember this detail. Anything that requires obvious storage becomes a burden. Space can be counted, smell travels, patterns repeat, repetition creates trails. The most valuable items at this stage are compact, durable, and capable of vanishing into other systems without leaving evidence behind. This is where it turns lethal for the careless. Because enforcement begins to emerge, not official. Informal. Groups coalesce around ideas like access, fairness, and redistribution. Those words sound moral? They're not. They're tools for justification. Once justification exists, intrusion follows naturally. The reframe is uncomfortable. Protection doesn't come from being armed. Weapons escalate attention. Protection comes from being irrelevant. If removing you doesn't improve access to anything, you're not worth the effort. Irrelevance is camouflage that doesn't wear out. Rich survivors understand this instinctively. They let others believe the source is dried up. They allow substitutes to fail publicly. They never correct the assumption. Attention drifts to louder targets. Pressure relocates. Stability returns. Not because things are safe, but because focus has moved on. And then, quietly, tomorrow tightens again. Eventually, people stop planning for recovery. The language shifts. Repair becomes maintenance. Improvement becomes stability. Hope shrinks into habit. This is the final transition. Not collapse, but acceptance. The system isn't coming back. This is it. Whatever works now is what people will cling to until it fails completely. At this stage, wealth is no longer counted. It's measured in resilience. How many failures can stack before your daily life degrades? How many mistakes others can make before they circle back to you again? Resilience isn't dramatic. It's boring, quiet, repetitive. That's why it's misunderstood until it's rare. This is the detail people forget. Rich items don't move much anymore. They don't circulate. They wait. Their value grows passively with every failed workaround, every temporary fix that breaks, every substitute that almost works and then doesn't. Time does the appreciating for you. The delayed consequence is psychological. People stop experimenting. Trial and error becomes too expensive. Failure costs too much energy. Eventually, they default to what works, even if it's imperfect. That's when your once ignored object stops being optional and starts being standard. This is where it turns permanent. The item isn't admired. It's assumed. It becomes infrastructure. No one praises it. No one questions it. They only notice when it's gone. That's the highest functional value anything can reach. And it gets worse one last time. Once something becomes standard, it becomes targeted. Copied badly. Replicated without understanding. Stripped down to appearance without function. That's when quality splits the field. The difference between almost works and still works stops being technical and starts being decisive. Remember this. Survival isn't about having the best things. It's about having the last things that continue functioning when approximation fails. When tolerance is gone. When error margins disappear. When there's no buffer left to hide flaws. By now, currency is a memory. Numbers feel fictional. Prices feel symbolic. What matters is continuity. Can life proceed today without negotiation? Can systems run without favors? Can failure be postponed one more cycle without attention? If it can, you're tolerated. If it can't, you're exposed. Survival isn't granted, it's tolerated.